Thanks for staying for this one. I appreciate it. So we'll kick it off here. Just want to talk a little bit about how I came to InfoSec. Come from a military background, law enforcement. When the British Home Office sent out a survey to a bunch of information security professionals about cybercrime and about how we're measuring cybercrime, I said, kind of in typical InfoSec fashion, we're doing it all wrong. And this presentation that you're going to see is really about my initial answers to that survey, and then Dave's fantastic research that we have a white paper actually that's now going to be published in EdPACS, which is a journal. So my background in this is, I would say, before it was cool to talk about advanced persistent threat, but I was the project manager for something called the Canadian Museum of Human Rights. It's not an ion cannon to defend against the empire should they arrive at Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada. But this is a human rights museum that is going to be a repository for a lot of different stuff that some nations really don't like. So the threat for us was really real, and I spent a great deal of time with the architects and with the systems guys and the security guys building what's the equivalent of a cyber mousetrap to actually find the infiltration. And we're using some technology, a lot of VM technology, but a lot of it is single-use disposable VMs for transactions. What am I doing now? I'm the security lead for a company called Logic Now. They make a software product to monitor infrastructure. And because every IT guy needs an exit strategy, I also run a consulting firm on the side back in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada as well. So this is kind of what it feels a little bit like to be in the information security industry, the gas fight from Zoolander. We laugh because we know what's going to happen. We know what the outcome of this is going to be. And unfortunately, we're finding ourselves more and more in that space, in that headspace where everything's going to explode. And unfortunately, as the information security guy, when it explodes, you lose your job. So this presentation is really going to be about maybe taking a different look at the attacks, taking a different look at advanced persistent threat, and talking a little bit about what this new sort of existence that we're trying to live in. There's a number of books that I like to talk about throughout this. Some really great reading. Most of the people here have probably read these books, but they're really some of the central themes that we're going to be dealing with as we move forward. That's around privacy and advanced persistent threat attacks and organized crime and the evolution of all of those type of things together. One of the central issues with, I'm going to say, information security is it ends up being perceived as much harder than it is. And we have a lot of anger. Last night, sitting around having some drinks with some folks, they're expressing how difficult it is to be in information security and how frustrating it is. And unfortunately, one of our major attacks sometimes is the users. And what we have to understand is that the users are like babes in the woods, okay? And the information security people are the people trying to prevent your users as hard as we can from hurting themselves. And that's really the philosophy we need to have. And, there's this great quote that flew around the UK healthcare system, that the medical system would be perfect if it wasn't for the patients, right? So this is sort of the same philosophy that we have to look at. And one of the other issues, and the whole idea behind this meaningful measurement that I want to get across to you, is that we're not helped by this industry that feeds off failure, that really actually tries to make a fairly easy to understand subject complex. What do I mean by that? It means that our attacks that we're seeing are really coming from only 4 sources, okay? They're coming from the email, they're coming from the web, insider mistakes or malicious activity, and over the wire. And that's it. But what's even more complicating than that is when we look at 93.9% of our attacks are really about email or web. That's it. Everything else is almost zilch. So when we look at our defenses and we're trying to defend the fort against everything, we're failing to realize that I think there's 2 attack vectors that really need our attention. And what's really frustrating that doesn't get a lot of publication and that doesn't get talked about is the same exploits are being used over and over and over again. So in 2014, 99.9% of the actual exploited vulnerabilities were actually disclosed and given a CVE number. And that very last point is really the one that I'm trying to get across. And unfortunately, the media doesn't really like to talk about this. But the reality is that 99.9% of your cyber incidents involve known and often patchable software vulnerabilities. So what does that leave us? It leaves us with your action plan, okay? This Adobe Flash issue is one that has galvanized the information security community. And it essentially comes down to this. Every single exploit kit that is out there is using Adobe Flash attacks, either 0-day, okay, or for unpatched Adobe Flash. So here's the thing. You have a 100% chance of not getting infected by Adobe Flash exploits if you uninstall Adobe Flash. So that's one of the takeaways. And unfortunately, what happens to us is the media makes us feel like this. The media makes us feel like we're the guys up on the ramparts here trying to prevent the orcs from climbing in, okay? And how do I know this? Because cyber insurance companies decide to use the same imagery in their propaganda. And this is one of the things that cyber insurance companies are working at cross purposes. We've all heard the term $450 billion per year is lost through cybercrime worldwide. Well, in 2011, there was a study that said there's $8 trillion being made. That was 2011. I haven't found a report that talks about what the whole net worth of the online industry is today. This was 2011, $8 trillion in the G8 countries. So you can imagine. So when we hear this alarmist term like $450 billion, okay, and we're going to hear when I deconstruct a few of these attacks, we're going to hear some big numbers. But in the grand scheme of things, $450 billion on $8 trillion is actually a really small amount. And it doesn't help. Go ahead.
A little bit off topic, but you mentioned cyber insurance. Is that really worth even considering?
So that's a sidebar discussion. We're going to talk about that because I have a slide on this that is going to blow your mind on that topic. So here we have RSA, big company, right, telling us that we all suck. And this came from the RSA conference, okay? But then there's this little company that did this study that showed that 97% of all your critical vulnerabilities documented could have been mitigated by the removal of administrative rights. Where was the parade on that one, okay? Where was the keynote speech that said, hey guys, if you just remove administrative rights, 99.5% of your vulnerabilities affecting Internet Explorer would be mitigated. So this is what my problem is right now. Because we look at these numbers and we say things like we're going to see huge growth in security. We're going to see the billion-dollar industry balloon. We're going to see 60% of all targeted attacks stuck small and medium organizations. We're going to see these statistics. I'm not denying that organizations get attacked. But when you contrast that, right? When you contrast that with what the easy steps so far are, which is remove Flash and remove administrative rights, it seems to me that that's the story. So McAfee puts out this new study, and they show what the value of this purloined personal identifiable information is. Okay, and they've broken it down by pricing, and they've broken it down by, what you're getting for your dollars and for your investments. Unfortunately, this is used now to determine how much you pay for cyber insurance and for security products based on how much of this data you might have in your repository. So this, again, is one of the situations where you have a company that is invested in selling security solutions coming up with numbers to help them sell more security solutions. I cite this as a really interesting report that came out from WebSense, which said in 2014, 99.3% of malicious files used in command and control URLs had been used by one or more malware samples. 98.2% of malware authors used command and control found in 5 other types of malware, okay? I wonder what product they're making. right? Could it be something to prevent command and control? Yeah. So this is one of the biggest problems that we have, is we have an industry feeding on itself, okay? And I'm going to give you a few examples of it. More importantly, math is hard, okay? One of the problems that we have are a whole bunch of different studies that come out that talk about the value of that stolen record, just like the McAfee report that I had up earlier, okay? What those reports don't take into consideration is things like class action lawsuits that all of a sudden the court says, yep, you have a class action lawsuit, Neiman Marcus. We don't even know how much money that's going to cost you yet, but we're talking tens of millions of dollars. That's not factored into the cost of the stolen record at this point. So you have these hidden costs, right? Then you have the cost of the breach itself. You've got the cost of the giant plane load of Mandiant guys that show up, that study it for 3 months, then write a really great report that they hand off to their next customer saying, what a great job we did. Now, let's think about this for a moment. We're all probably familiar with the way Lockheed Martin got breached, right? RSA got breached, and they stole essentially what amounted to one record. They stole the algorithm for generating those two-factor authentication tokens. So then they took that one record and they breached Lockheed Martin. Now, Lockheed Martin doesn't admit the fact that classified information got stolen, but 11 months later, we see a clone of the F-35 and we see a clone of the Reaper drone roll down the runway in China. So, of course, we're going to be sure here. So my question to you is, how do we put a value on that one record that was stolen from RSA, right? When now that one record was responsible for what could be tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars of theft and intellectual property. So you're going to see some Swift on security because she's fantastic and I really enjoy the ideas that they come up with there. More importantly, we're going to go through a little bit and we're going to take a look at some of these attacks. And we're going to try and strip away some of the stupidity and hype that's around them. And I think what's most important is that we're spending a lot of time and cameras are getting put on people that should never talk to the media under any circumstance. I cite Utah Public Safety Commissioner Keith Squires, okay? Now, I'm sure Keith has a great career in counter-narcotics and bomb disposal. But he sounds like a complete tool when he stands up and he talks about a 10,000-fold increase. Go ahead.
If I can interrupt, quick question for the room. When I do breach planning for customers, I include media training for the executives. Is anyone else doing that?
Super important. A good public relations firm will save you a lot. And we're seeing this play out in the TalkTalk breach too, about they're essentially doing everything right. But I want to go back to this point here because we hear these terms like 25 to 30,000 attacks per day. We're shaking our head. These are not attacks. Back in 1999, a guy by the name of Scott Moulton, okay, he got in trouble, right? He got in trouble for scanning a system. And he went to court. And what the court found was that, yeah, you know what? You did have that unauthorized access component, but you didn't do any damage. You didn't do the $5,000 in damage that's required under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act to consider it a attack, okay? So this is what I'm going to. If somebody is pinging you or nmapping you, this does not constitute an attack under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, okay? It's an inconvenience, it's an annoyance, but it stands on Cyber Bullshit Mountain as being the most irritating statistic that we hear all the time. So we move on to distributed denial of service. Distributed denial of service, and I quote, volumetric or reflection weapon of choice for hackers, political hacktivists, cyber extortionists, and international cyber terrorists. That's the kind of language of people downloading the low Earth ion cannon and turning it on your IP address. Okay? These are the equivalent of the orcs. These are the Igors. These are not the people that are advanced persistent threat groups, although it sure as heck sounds like these are really bad people when you have things like international cyber terrorists. Okay? This is really a before the firewall problem. So I work pretty much exclusively in small and medium businesses. That's where the company's focus is. So in a lot of cases, you're really dealing with a situation where it's an ISP problem, okay? And this is one of the things where I know there's a lot of controversy about that kind of statement, but when you look at the majority of businesses that are online today, they have a single IP address and probably about 1.5 megabytes down and about 750K up if they're lucky, okay? And yes, they can be victimized by a denial of service attack, but the point here is that this is an ISP problem. Now, we can go back to good old code spaces who got blown up. But the important thing to understand here is that the media portrayed this as a victim of a distributed denial of service attack, okay? If you look through what they actually said was the hackers were in us for several months, deleted our backups, corrupted our machines, threatened us with a denial of service attack. So this is commonly cited as, oh, look, denial of service attack is really dangerous. Yeah, but so is letting the bad guys into your system for 3 months. All right? Let's take a little bit of a journey now into the brute force out there, okay? So brute force is essentially, comes in a couple flavors, basically exploring your open ports and trying to guess passwords, trying to force your way in. Or now SQL injection really falls into that category as well. But when you do this and you leave VNC and RDP open to the internet, you're just asking for it, okay? So figure it out, guys. TeamViewer, LogMeIn, there's tons of different solutions out there so that you can architect an entire network that has no ports exposed, especially in small and medium business. There's no requirement for hosted services now that you're using cloud-based services to have any ports except maybe VPN open to the internet. And then we have another problem on our hands, okay? Especially at the small and medium business. We have WordPress. And unfortunately, WordPress is an advanced persistent threat and enabling for cybercrime like nobody's business. And it's not that this is bad software. The problem is that most people put these WordPress installations on a machine that they then forget about, okay? And it's like, hey, it's the corporate website, no big deal. Well, back in the day, we had defacement attacks. We had guys that would go in, deface the website, and you go to the website and be something horrible, and you'd restore it from backup. But now what's happening is folks are getting into your WordPress site, they're leaving the WordPress site alone, and they're building their phishing, their drive-by download sites on top of your site, or hosting their malware, or using it as a spam engine. So the attack is pivoted from mere defacement. It's actually pivoted now back to utilizing that resource that they got ill-gotten access to. And how do we know that this is kind of going on and this is what's in the mind? So there is this vulnerability that came out where you could make a Microsoft Internet Information Server reboot, okay? And really not a big deal. You throw a packet at it and it reboots. But Microsoft flagged this as a remote code execution vulnerability. And they pushed out a patch fairly quickly. Okay, 22nd of April. However, on the 19th of April, in the underground forum that I put up the picture of, was a remote code exploit for any of these internet information servers, which is about 22% of the internet, if you can believe it, that would give you remote code execution on an unpatched machine. Okay, so one of our challenges right now is we need to anticipate that this is the rapid cycle that is going on in cybercrime, and we need to patch accordingly. I'm recommending that people patch weekly now, okay, and get into that cycle and rhythm. And one of the keys is if you uninstall applications that are vulnerable like Flash, well, guess what? You have a lot less stuff to patch. So that's one of the ways to go. Now, a lot of folks say, Ian, 22% of the internet, how long is it going to take the bad guys to find those machines? Well, in about the time it takes to learn church history, you can find every single unpatched internet information server on the internet in about 5 minutes, okay? So this idea that you're in rural Michigan and you've got a little web server there and it's running internet information server and you haven't had time to move them to Apache, basically it's going to be found. It's going to get grabbed. So we get to phishing attacks. So phishing attacks, we've all heard of them. This is really the #1 cyber criminal attack vector, period, right? And ransomware should be looked at as an opportunity, okay? It's a pain in the ass, for sure, but it's testing your ability to defend that network, okay? It's testing your ability to basically do and make sure that you have some business continuity and business resiliency. And unfortunately, what we're seeing is, 77% of these incidents are deliberate interaction because of users, okay? Users clicking on stuff, users opening stuff. And we can't get angry with them for that because, quite frankly, if they've advertised for a job and they get resume.zip, the administrative assistant is going to open it, okay? That's her job. So unfortunately, it blows up and you've got a ransomware. In the early attacks, removing administrative rights actually mitigated that completely. But now we're into a new phase where this is just being executed in a lot of cases in a JavaScript, in a poisonous JavaScript, and sometimes we actually have to let our users use stuff like that. So one of the best mitigative strategies you can do is look at the application whitelisting capabilities of the operating system itself. They called it App Locker. And it actually works quite well in locking down an environment and preventing folks from running programs that they don't have authorization to run. So in the breach of OPM, in the OPM breach, you have the White House suggesting that businesses, the OPM, apply patches for critical flaws promptly, use antivirus products, check logs for attack indicators, deploy two-factor authentication, and strengthen controls for privileged administrative users. Basically, take those administrative rights away. My question would be, why wasn't this being done in the first place? This is simple shit, okay? This is and we had some jokes last night, but any CISSP coming out of his course should be able to do this, okay? Should be able to look at what the best practices in the industry are. I think it's embarrassing. And one of the reasons why I think it's embarrassing and it's confusing for OPM is this the sort of advice that they get from the FBI, okay? Social engineering or computer intrusion techniques, okay? Computer intrusion techniques. I need an anti-computer intrusion technique device. No, you need to tell your users not to click on strange web links and or open attachments from people they don't know. So this is one of the things that I am really disappointed about is that, yes, is this a threat? This is the cyber equivalent of me picking up the phone and asking you to give me money. This is what the threat is, all right? But no, we make it sound like computer intrusion techniques are being used on you. Ooh, scary. So we move to drive-by downloads. And drive-by downloads are increasingly becoming a problem because we can deliver web links in a bunch of different ways. We can deliver it via instant messaging. We can deliver it by email web links. And basically what's happening out there is that poorly defended websites are being used as proxies in the attacks, okay? And what we need to do is we need to focus on our websites, on securing those websites, because those are the things that are throwing out tens of thousands of pieces of spam. Those are the things that are being used to host all this malware. And if we focused on defending that and making sure that that wasn't compromised, I think we'd see a lot of value for our security money. And it makes sense, because look at what the statistics tell us. 54% of our infections, of our exploited systems, are coming from interaction with the web. Okay? There's some compelling reasons for, mail protection, obviously like barracudas and or proxies to prevent users from getting infected. Now, one of the reasons why cyber criminals have moved away from delivering email as a preferred means of attack and to drive-by downloads is because of this. Okay? And again, we see Flash coming up again. But we see that the fact that these browsers that we have are really responsible for getting those infections onto the machines in the first place, okay? And this is because the browser interacts at a much more deeper system level than your actual email client, okay? So this is one of the things that I'm seeing in terms of the threat landscape is pivoting towards that browser. So one of the things that happened was trying to convince the business, and this is kind of the old way of thinking, but trying to convince the business that their reputation will be at stake. They'll be blacklisted. There could be an investigation or seizure, surveillance, no-fly list, all sorts of terrible things that could happen from not securing your systems. The reality is that it's economic that's going to drive this out. And as we go through this and we take a look at some more of these attacks, you'll soon start seeing that Everything we do in IT security can be easily quantified in dollar cents, okay, in terms of uptime and in terms of availabilities of systems. That's where we need to focus on. So we get back to spear phishing. So spear phishing is really interesting because it's the most commonly used attack for those advanced persistent threat groups, okay, for the ones that, make the news. In reality, these are the equivalent of Ocean's 11 style of attacks. They're really not cyber attacks in the classic sense. They are con jobs. They are really social engineering attacks. And in some cases, the social engineering attack is where the vulnerability persists because people are being asked to do things because they think that's the right thing that they should be doing, and they don't have good controls or policies in place to change all of that. Because when we analyze malware, what does it really do? It only does 4 things. It modifies the system registry, okay, so that usually it runs right away. It injects code into a DLL or running process. It drops something onto disk, or it connects to the internet. And in fact, if it's not doing those things, it's probably not malware, okay? And the connect to the internet thing, especially in small and medium business, is the smoking gun, okay? That's having situational awareness of your egress, of what's coming out of your network. That will make a huge difference for you. So here's an example from a client that had a problem. And the problem is they were basically asked by a person inside the company to transfer some money. And you'll notice the domains. You have Arctic GAL and Arctic GLA. Okay? So what did the cyber criminals do here? They registered a domain that looked very similar, okay, to the domain of the actual customer itself. So we took a little bit of a look at this. And as it turns out, this domain was registered by Vistaprint Technologies in Ontario. And I said, well, that's odd because, you would think that if you were conducting cybercrime, you probably wouldn't want to tell them exactly who you were and how you registered the domain. So we came to the conclusion that these folks had probably been compromised in terms of their 2Cows account to register domains. Probably fairly badly compromised. Or there's a possibility that the admin over there was moonlighting as a cyber criminal. But then we took a look and we found, okay, let's look at this IP address. Well, it turns out it's in Amazon Web Services, and the cyber criminals use the cloud too, okay? And they had 54,000 domains registered on this server. Okay, so now we're on to something that's a little bit more interesting here because we're dealing with a whole bunch of fraudulent domains. And then finally, we take a look at what was actually on that box, and it was a squid proxy. And Operation Laundry Service was commenced, and I don't want to get into those exact details. But your action plan here is really to help get rid of this situation. So you contact Vistaprint and you say you got a problem, clean up your act. Or please, because we're Canadians after all, so we'll be polite. Contact 2Cows, you've got fraudulent domain registration, terms and conditions of service violations, requests for blacklist and removal of the domain information, and certainly you can facilitate that by calling up Vistaprint, and they're pretty much certain going to say, we didn't register that domain. And they may even want their money back for registering that domain. Contact Amazon, fraudulent activity, terms of service violation, request for the takedown of the server, or turn it over to the FBI, okay? So there are ways that we can fight back in this system against these folks that are trying to get at us, and the simpler we make it, and in a way this is kind of hackback, but this is kind of legal hackback. You found a system that basically is conducting crime against your organization, and there's some steps that you can take to figure out how to defend yourself. So in some ways, we've started to create a better criminal. We've gotten to the point now where we have what's called advanced persistent threats. And I'm going to go into a few of them. We're going to talk about a few of what their activities are. Saudi Amoco, we're probably all familiar with that attack, which bricked 30,000 machines. And caused probably a great deal of work outage for the organization, costed a fair amount of money. It was attributed to state-sponsored hackers, okay? But what's more important about this is this wasn't delivered via an email. This wasn't actually delivered even by a web link. This was delivered by a USB drive, by an insider malicious threat. So one of the things that is quick to point out when you're dealing with these kind of destructive attacks, usually the delivery method is internal. However, there's going to be a few that we're going to see where the situation has evolved. And that really comes to advanced persistent threat foreign nation states, which I'm a little bit more familiar with. So what we're going to see here is that advanced persistent threat foreign intelligence services combine all of the modus operandi of your criminal organizations, but they get like an unlimited budget and no chance of actually ever getting in trouble for doing what they're doing. So you have an order of magnitude and sophistication coming at you, and there are some ways, and I worked with Joe McCarthy on this actually, about how do we build a cyber mousetrap in how do we catch these guys at work. Because the difference between a cybercrime attack is advanced persistent threat is going to get in there, they're going to linger, and they're going to move around in your network. In general, the cybercrime attacks I've seen are the guys are in, they get what they need, and they're out. So be it credit cards, be it personal identifiable information, the attack doesn't last. When you're dealing with this is an attack on usually intellectual property. Okay, so going after whatever secrets you might have. So the idea here is to isolate the network into segments and really frustrate the bad guys from moving around in the network. Who here thinks that printers should be able to be available on the internet? Right. But small and medium businesses are building flat file networks with no segregation in these networks at all. And the problem is that small medium businesses are usually supplying the nuts and bolts for larger, possibly DoD, possibly other things, projects. So the problem is that if you have an unpatched HP printer on the internet with every protocol known to mankind being broadcast, bad things are going to happen. And one of the interesting ideas around this architecture where you're actually having different subnets is for those of us that do this kind of work, you can get in there, you can mirror the port into that particular subnet and look at all the traffic on Wireshark and go, listen, I have no humans in my office right now. The humans have gone home. Why am I seeing HTTPS to Pakistan? This doesn't seem right. This doesn't seem normal. So I want to talk about this one attack which was heralded as a cybercrime attack of epic proportions. Now, it was attributed to the Israelis, and the Israelis targeted 3 luxury hotels. They targeted the luxury hotels to try and get an idea on the negotiations that were going on over their nuclear, over the nuclear issues that the Iranians were doing. So what went on here? Well, it was interesting because they infected the machines with a number of interesting exploits. The most interesting exploit was if you can still believe this, and this is like 2014, okay? I can give you a font file that when you install that font file gives me kernel level access to your Windows box. This vulnerability has been with us. But who here knows a little bit about Windows security permissions? Anyone? Okay, perfect. So what security permission do you need to install font files on a box?
I think it's only just that.
Correct, you are. So what does this tell us about these people that got infected? This was a 0-day attack on font files. So what happened here, guys, is that people had local admin on their laptop and the JavaScript injection, because what they did is they went to the portal for logging into the hotel Wi-Fi. That fired up a JavaScript injection that delivered this exploit onto their machines, which was essentially a font file that was outside the constraints of its buffer and overflowed, and that allowed them to land their malware. Okay? What else did we see? Well, it's really interesting because in a network architecture, folks, should workstations ever connect directly for DNS to the internet? No. Yeah, usually you have an internal DNS server that is essentially a proxy for any workstation request that's going outside your network. So if you wrote one firewall one firewall that prevented workstations from accessing the internet directly, you would have shut down their 8.8.8.8 tunneling that they were doing for their command and control. All right? So two very simple things right there. And as we go along, this defeats these kind of attacks, okay, very easily. And this is why we need to build this cyber mousetrap, because we're taking a really long time to figure out what's going wrong, okay? Why we're getting owned. Why is our data getting exfiltrated? Well, it comes down, especially in small, medium business, to this. It comes down to egress. We are not preventing stuff from leaving our network, okay? So we're letting our printers on the internet send email, okay? That doesn't sound like a good idea. All right, unencrypted email as well. Okay, we're leaving things like VNC and RDP open on the internet. Again, well, not you guys, because you know what you're doing, but apparently some of our brethren haven't gotten that memo yet. So we can do a lot of things. We can talk about deny rules for workstations inside that subnet. We can talk about deny rules for admin boxes within that subnet. We can put printers on a subnet that doesn't even go onto the internet, and we can do a whole bunch of stuff around network segmentation and event logs so we can detect that command and control activity. Because malware has to reach out to a command and control server. It has to. Otherwise, it's not really malware. It's something else that you got to worry about. So I like to come up with this simple rule. Weird shit equals compromise, okay? And essentially, it gives you a number of different avenues to detect when bad guys are inside your network, all right? Explosions, general protection faults in your event logs on machines that 72 hours ago weren't exhibiting that, okay? Failed patches. When you can patch all of your machines, but one machine can't be patched because the patches keep failing, that's a machine that you maybe want to explore a little bit further, right? Slow network traffic. Okay, in a lot of cases, it's malware causing the problem, okay, or the ISP. Probably equal story. If you're a Comcast customer, it's probably 90% ISP. And when new ports open up on your firewall, when you see traffic coming out strange ports that you've never had before, workstations all of a sudden trying to NTP outside the network, that doesn't make sense. And when I talked about saving your websites, this is really what I meant. It's pretty easy business case for a web application firewall. It's, does your website talk to a database? Can I see what I type in a field on a page? So can I put an apostrophe into the search bar? That's always a fun one to check out. And does the site reference a local file? If it does those things, if your website does those things, put a web application firewall in front of it. Make it a hell of a lot harder to hack, rather than getting owned by some guy that's firing up Metasploit and throwing a bunch of cross-site scripting vulnerabilities against it, right? These things aren't expensive anymore. They used to be. Used to be super expensive. Now they've really come down in price. So what brings us to what I'm going to call the granddaddy of them all in terms of cyber sensationalization is Kaspersky's equation group, which we all know after reading what they did was the NSA. And they were used quotes such as the god of cyber espionage, an astonishing technical accomplishment, the Death Star of malware, okay? So let's call it like it is. This is a advanced persistent threat, nation-state resources. I would expect them to be capable of this, except for the fact that this was all disclosed as a possibility in 2009 at CanSec West, okay? And this report came out, I think it was 2013 or 2014. All right? So this is kind of making hype out of something that we already knew about. We already knew that BIOS level infectors. In fact, Dan Kaminsky about 4 years ago at DEF CON showed us how to hide all sorts of cool stuff on a hard drive firmware. Okay? So this has all been around. Which moves me to these two guys. APT-28 Pawnstorm, probably been in the news quite a bit, and APT-29 Temp Monkeys. Okay? This is where things got really, truly bizarre, and it shows a lowest level possible in the media in terms of reporting, and what I like to call the Wheel of Attribution. Okay, and how did it work? Well, yes, the Polish Stock Exchange got attacked along with French TV and the New York Times. Because credentials were posted on Pastebin and Allah Akbar was mentioned, it was suddenly attributed to jihadists that broke up this website, not Russians armed with X-Agent Mac iOS. This was later disclosed on. And James Clapper of the FBI, or no, he was NSA, suggested that perhaps the Russian threat was more severe than previously assessed. Okay? Yeah, I would say so. Fast forward to APT-29 Temp Monkeys, who basically blew up, or is attributed to have blown up, a smelting plant in Germany. They were armed with some malware that targets ICS and SCADA systems. But again, because there were videos of monkeys in the phishing emails that were sent, it had to have been the Chinese. Why? Because monkeys don't live in Russia. All right? So this is about the lowest bar in cyber media hype that I've ever had. And it led to what I'm going to call one of the stupidest things that we've ever seen in cybersecurity, which was the treaty that was signed between the Chinese and the Americans that they wouldn't, hack each other for economic reasons anymore. Like that, we're just going to agree that we're not going to hack each other. Now, it's really interesting to me why they signed this treaty. It is a get out of the shit that I made policy, and I'll tell you why. About a year ago, President Obama signed an executive order that basically stated that if an American company suffers damage at the hands of a foreign company, there will be a compelling requirement to sanction that offending country, okay? We had the Chinese dead to rights on the OPM hack. All the forensic evidence pointed towards them and everything like that, okay? So the point here is that for economic reasons and the fact that the United States and China are some of the biggest trading partners, and there's a little fisticuff brewing with the Chinese out there in the China Sea, amongst a bunch of other things, this is low-hanging fruit. This was an easy thing to do to appease everybody that we're taking strong action. I suspect this will do very little to deter any continued Chinese attacks on American business or any other nation for that matter, because that's not usually being conducted by government operatives. That is usually subcontracted criminal organizations. And I bet after reading Brian Krebs's book, you will soon see the connection between the Russian government and the cyber criminals as being tenuous at best. There's a few more that I just want to explore here. One was this. 81% of healthcare executives say their organizations have been compromised by at least one malware, botnet, or other kind of cyber attack during the past 2 years. 81%, okay? So what I'd like to know is if this is really true, why isn't there a congressional committee looking at this? Why are we concerned about a bunch of emails on an email server that was at home and not the fact that 81% of our healthcare organizations have been breached or attacked? So again, this strikes me as being, one of our beloved and well-recognized consulting organizations drumming up the cyber war drums in order to throw a few more numbers of growth up there. So we talked a little bit about cyber insurance. It was a question that came up, and this is the really good part. So Columbia Casualty Company, okay, alleges that Cottage Health Systems failed to do a bunch of cybersecurity things. So a great example is they didn't patch within a 30-day SLA window, okay? 30 days to get your patches onto your machines. They failed to replace some default settings on security devices, failed to undergo an annual security audit, outsourced data to firms with poor security, right? Maybe small, medium businesses got sort of outsourced there, and failed to provide adequate detection and tracking of changes in the network. So what happened? Well, the cyber insurance company said, yeah, we're not paying you. And they were like, what? And they were like, yeah, no, we're not feeling it. You had a whole bunch of things that you needed to do and you didn't do them, so we're not paying you. So here's the answer in short of cyber insurance. Cyber insurance is going to be both awesome for our for the security industry, and I'll get into why that's going to be in a case. However, in the meantime, it's going to be a case where you're going to run two parallel investigations. You're going to be running an investigation to figure out what happened and how bad that was. Then you're going to be running an investigation, usually by high-priced consultants that the insurance company is going to bring in to see if you were compliant, okay? So as long as you have gobs of money, you're going to be fine, and you might actually get a payout. However, I believe right now it's $1 million per $500,000 in liability coverage, all right? It's skewed. So it really makes sense if you're like a law firm and you are doing 2 gigantic mergers of companies and you want a cyber insurance policy to cover that while the 2 companies are merging and you're dealing with files. It makes sense because you can bill that back to the customer. Okay? It doesn't make sense if you're a small, medium business. Okay? What makes sense is uninstalling Flash and patching and updating your machines. So one of the big things that we saw at DEF CON this year, if you were there or if you were following the news at all, was the 1.4 million Chrysler vehicles that were recalled. Everybody probably, if you were doing piecework in the Sudan or something, you probably didn't hear about this. But the reality is it was heralded as a seminal moment in security research where responsible disclosure led to this outcome. I would suggest that it's GM looking at its economic situation going, holy shit, this is a huge business risk. We got to fix this. I don't think that this was as altruistic a moment for security researchers as we thought it was. And I will point out the fact that, oddly enough, in this particular case, it had to be a demonstrable external attack rather than a software review of the software used in Volkswagen diesel products. Okay? So I find it kind of interesting. But let's just pretend for a moment that it was a really good thing. The litigation that would have happened to GM should, and we're kind of seeing this play out with Volkswagen about the lying, but the litigation that would have transpired if people died as a result of a software vulnerability would be extraordinary. Okay, it would be all-consuming, and it could seriously wreck or destroy the company. So I suggested, and it was sort of backed up by Dark Tangent, that the road to the Internet of Things will be paved with litigation. And I want to give you an example of this kind of tomfoolery, if you will. So let's take a dishwasher, for instance, that has a web server in it, and it's connected to the internet. And the idea here is that in conjunction with your smart house and everything like that, it's going to run the dishwashers at the most optimal time for you when the price of your electricity is lowest. Or you can turn it on remotely if you have customers coming over. Or not customers, but friends and family. So here's the problem with this. If you know anything about the way large businesses do procurement, so if you have a contractor and you have an 80-unit apartment building, you're going to buy the same dishwasher and you're going to install it, okay? And let's say that's a multi-story apartment building. I think you guys can see where I'm going with this. I should put the slide deck up with the flames, with the gas fight on it. Because here's the problem. If that software vulnerability can affect that dishwasher, then it can affect all of those dishwashers. And when you're in a giant building and say the software vulnerability allows you to take remote control of that dishwasher, and say you put some malware into it that makes the dishwasher full but not drain out ever, you turn on all the dishwashers in the apartment complex, all 80 of them at the same time. You're now talking about millions of dollars of damage, all right? And this is where it comes down to the insurance. The insurance will have to pay to put everything back together again. Millions of dollars. If there's one thing that can be universally said about insurance companies is they never like to pay out, ever. So they have a power called subrogation. Does anybody know what that term is? Yeah, guy nodding at the back. It allows an insurance company, when it has to pay out a claim, to sue everybody. Okay? Now that puts a shiver up the spine of the computer programmer in Belarus who was responsible for that software vulnerability. That puts a shiver up the spine of the manufacturer that was supposed to Q&A that washing or dishwasher. So here we have a situation where insurance companies are going to take a dim view of physical damage resulting from software vulnerabilities. I truly feel that in the weeks and months and years ahead, that we will see a situation where software is treated the equivalent of when you make a crib that kills babies and you put your baby in there, the CEOs and the executives go to jail, and usually the company is fined out of existence, not to mention having to pay compensation for all those people that it hurt. So I can see this moving forward. Now, one of the cool things that we're doing, and I'm just going to pivot because that's a little bit dark and nasty. I'm going to pivot a little bit and talk a little bit about our automated big data future. And one of the things that I want to start seeing is cyber threat information being shared amongst different pieces of software. And I'll give you an example here. So say you have a feed from Barracuda or mail protection thing. You find out those top 5,000 spamming IP addresses. And you have maybe a whole bunch of customers. If their IP address shows up on that top list, well, you've got an indication of compromise right there. So we don't need to go through this extended process of like forensically. We just need to look at the fact of whether or not our network is blasting email that we can't account for. It doesn't seem that difficult, especially at the small and medium business. And enterprise, I'm going to say it probably gets a little bit more complex. But what I want to do then is I want to be able to block anybody's access via web to those sites. Why? Because the machine that is sending out that email is quite possibly hosting not only a command and control node, but also the drive-by download site, okay? So by preventing our users from visiting it, by identifying the fact that this machine is perhaps even inside a customer's network, we have an opportunity for a big win. So let's look at one more attack. Let's look at the Carbonic Attack. Now this was really interesting because the report came out and it said between $300 million and $1 billion of losses. $1 billion of losses. That seems really tremendous, okay? And it was mostly against Russians and Eastern European banks. And they think it was a Russian-Chinese mixed crew of pretty sophisticated folks. And there's a number of different iterations of this attack, but the one specifically I'm going to talk about was how did the bad guys get the malware onto the banking system computers, okay? This is what interested me the most. So all observed cases used spear phishing emails. Okay, again, all right, so we're talking about spear phishing emails. And look what they were sending. They were sending .doc files, or Word documents, or CPL files, okay? And what I find really interesting about this is they were using vulnerabilities from 2012, 2013, and 2014, all of which have been patched. All of which have been patched. So this situation, I find, says two very interesting things to me. First, it says the financial institutions in question were so obsessed with perimeter security that they were not doing a vulnerability patch management inside their network, okay? The second thing is it would appear that they didn't even have antivirus on it because the actual Trojan that was used in the attack was 4 years old, okay? So what was going on here? Not patched and updated machines, no antivirus or ineffective antivirus, okay? Two things could have prevented this attack right there. Now, why 300 million to 1 billion? Why that such a range in number? To this day, the banks don't know which were legitimate financial transactions and which weren't. Because what did that remote access Trojan do? It set up the equivalent of the Clooney and Pitt scene in Ocean's 11, where they put a camera in front of a fake vault, and the guys are watching everything is okay. And what happened? What was the user experience? Well, the users were told that after they had used their two-factor authentication token, a screen came up saying that there was a problem with your account. Please call this 1-900 number, 1-800 number, and we'll walk you through your verification. In meantime, the cyber criminals were behind that screen that the user was seeing, doing legitimate banking transactions with the two-factor authenticated banking app, okay? So it was one of these attacks where they set up a call center and they asked date of birth and they gathered all sorts of information, probably before whatever the equivalent of an Eastern European long weekend is, right? At about 4 o'clock in the afternoon where you just want to get the fuck out of work. So this was an attack that did a couple of interesting things. One, they absolutely knew what their targets were. I think they probably reconnaissanced the environment. 3, Probably Eastern Europe, even banks are a little bit not so much with the licensed software, so they couldn't patch an update or they didn't patch an update, and they had ineffective antivirus. So again, this was again proclaimed as one of these sophisticated cyber attacks. Doesn't really sound too sophisticated to me. So we're getting to the end here. So how do we manage this? How really do we do what we do without getting so depressed about it? Well, let's move away from sensationalism. Let's examine let's not examine the consequences of a breach, because we know that if we get breached, we kind of probably lose our jobs, right? It sucks for us. So who is not important is how, and compromise indicators are more important than financial costs, right? The most important thing for my world, though, is that the data that is derived from large enterprises is not relevant to SMB. And the bottom line here is that when we hear about breach, what we need to know is what failed in that organization, not about the malware. What were some of the factors that led to the compromise? That's more interesting, because if I'm running a hospital, if I'm running a financial institution, I want to know how those guys got owned so that I can make those changes. And lastly, let's get really good at backup, okay? Backup and restore. It sounds trivial and it sounds awful, but it's really the only thing that will save your ass. And it'll save your ass from self-inflicted, right? Where you do something and you go, oh shit, right? But it'll also save you from the bad guys, especially when it comes to ransomware. And I can't tell you how many systems I've been to and audited where the backups are just atrocious, or they're just not happening, or the guys gave up, right? Or they say, which gets them almost a free throat punch, we have RAID, so we don't need backup. So don't fall into that trap. You guys are all laughing. So that's it. I want to thank you for your kind attention. Truly appreciate it. And I'll be hanging around for the next day. And I guess, do we have some time for questions? Just, yeah, I plotted it out here. I got the timery thing going. Anyone with any questions? No? Okay, well, we'll get the next person up here. Thank you very much.